Okay, guys, we're going to revise the impact of the Industrial Revolution on sport and physical activity for A-level PE. So, typically the area is broken down into three sections. So you have the role of the social developments and the impacts they have had, urbanization and the impacts urbanization has had, and elements of the education changes. Now, this is looking at the impact of education throughout the Industrial Revolution rather than education changes on their own. So that could be a whole different video, but we're just going to be tying that into the impacts it's had in the Industrial Revolution. So let's start looking at some exam questions about the Industrial Revolution and how they might be worded. So you may be asked questions that ask about the developments that occurred during the Industrial Revolution and the impacts, how sport developed during the Industrial Revolution, the impacts that it had. Or you might be asked with how sport changed or expanded or globalized as a consequence of the Industrial Revolution. Now, the two different things. So there's the developmental phase, and then there's this sort of, as in how sport evolved into what we see it now. But then the second phase would be after the Industrial Revolution had occurred and the changes were limited. It's that spread of sport and how that changed. This is just going to be focusing on the developmental side of it, the Industrial Revolution, the impacts it had to early sport. So some of the societal developments that we could talk about are on the screen here, and you should just be able to define each of these and have a sentence for each of them. So you could just pause the video and just write each of these headings out and then give a sentence for each of these, and then come back to the video in a second when I explain them. So the first is urbanization. You should be able to define that as the movement or the migration of the population from the rural communities and the villages into the urban towns and factory towns that were developing as a consequence of the Industrial Revolution. And there's a lot of impacts on sport and the development of sport, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, that is linked to this. You've got the emergence and development of transport. So particularly the steam engines and trains allowed people to move up and down the country more easily, which obviously they could take their sport with them and share the sport, but also have a standardized set of rules that they would play their sport. So one town could play another town and everyone agrees with the rules because the sport can travel. And that obviously led to things like fixtures and so on and so forth. The printed press developed, so rules could be recorded and written down, but also teams could be followed and progress could be followed through the newspapers and the early emergence of the newspapers. Muscular Christianity was key and developing throughout the Industrial Revolution, before the Industrial Revolution, and then really emerging throughout the Industrial Revolution with the cult of athleticism and sport. Really, the values that you learned in sports and physical activity really linked heavily to this idea of muscular Christianity and athleticism. The education system obviously developed from being public schools, where prior to the Industrial Revolution, it was really only upper class kids that went to the public schools, upper class boys that went to public schools, and where sport was developed, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But also now we get the emergence of more state schools and the importance of PE being brought into the state schools, which again is linked to that muscular Christianity and development there. Technological developments happen with machinery, but also that meant equipment for sports was developing and becoming more affordable, but also things like stadiums and sort of sports facilities were being developed as well at the same time, which is all linked to the Industrial Revolution. We get the emergence of the middle class. So previously to the Industrial Revolution, we had the feudal system with two classes, but now we get the idea of the middle class emerging to make a three-class system. And the economy changed towards a more of a capitalist economy, and we get the emergence of things like commercialization, professionalism, the idea that sport would be making money, which is impactful because we talk about factory teams and factory owners making money off those sports. And then various impacts. I mean, you could talk about lots of impacts, but just some of the various impacts are on the screen here now as well. So you get the idea that the increase in media exposure helps sport travel and spread around the country. The idea that literacy skills develop with the education system and people learning to read for the work that they had to take part in, and obviously the developing of this middle class. So where the rules could be understood and then spread across the country. The aspirations of the working class, so that wasn't just confined to being necessarily workers. There was an opportunity to progress and become managers, and therefore access the world of the middle class, and therefore other sports such as tennis and those sort of developmental elements of the class structure is linked into the middle class there. But also we've got the growth of national governing bodies, which is linked to the education system, the classes, and the idea of needing the rules governed and regulated by a particular group of people, and the emergence of national governing bodies for each sport was a consequence of some of these social developments of the Industrial Revolution. Now, there are two ways we can look at how sport changed during the Industrial Revolution, and there's sort of two pathways that happened at the same time, and both of them impacted, and they both had the same outcome, but they were both working. So you get the idea of the urbanization side, the sort of the things that were going on in the factory towns, but you've also got the things that were happening in the education system, particularly public schools, and they were both sort of working at the same time, developing, which then impacted the general growth and development of sport. So if we look at the first side of urbanization, I've put urbanization here, and it's not necessarily the key area we're looking at, but just sort of understand that we're talking about towns and factory towns. So the first thing is, obviously we know about urbanization and people moving from the villages to the towns during the Industrial Revolution. That essentially had an impact on the need for space to be. Well, there was a restricted space. The games that they played had to develop to fit the spaces around them. So we ended up having dimensions of pitches put in place and team sizes restricted. Those sort of things happened to the general game because of urbanization. Whereas as they moved into the towns, we start getting the rules and developments inside the town. So the first big change was, as people working in these factories, they had the 10-hour work act, or the Factories Act, and this allowed people to have regular time off on Saturday half days, and they nothing else to do, so they would play their sports that they used to know. And obviously with the urbanization, they're restricted, so we had limited numbers of players, for example, going from the mob games to specific numbers in teams, and restricted pitch sizes, and we have a time limit because of the amount of time they have available. So we start getting the rules that are changing of these sports. The factories developed their own teams, and the entrepreneurial factory owners would recognize that this was drawing in spectators who would watch these games, and they would then use their factory workers to represent the factory teams, and that brings in the idea of broken time payments and the early commercialization of sport, where we get the early sort of side of professionalism developing, and broken time payment space is where a player was paid to play for the sport, or compensate for the time away from work to play sport for their factory teams. And when I mean sport, we're generally talking about football in these early days. We get the rise of spectators, gate money. These spectators had money because they were working in the factories, and the factory owners recognised this and would charge gate money, and therefore making the money back. And we get this commercial triangle, this commercialisation sort of developing. The sporting press would popularise the sports and allow for the promotion of fixtures, but also the rules that could be codified, and national governing bodies could then regulate these rules. And then finally, transport, which also developed as a consequence of urbanisation and the developments in the towns, and therefore one team could play another team, and they could move up and down the country playing each other. In fact, some different towns could play one another. At the same time as this, so we're getting the role of education system, and if you get a question on this and just generally the era of the Industrial Revolution, you can talk about the role of public schools. So the idea that mob games were played at these early public schools, where the games afternoons were slowly introduced, where we get the role of the sixth formers to regulate the games, the value of those games recognised by, say, like Thomas Arnold, and then we get the sort of idea of codification of the rules. That was taken up a step further, where we get Oxbridge. So Oxford and Cambridge, students would leave the public schools, go to Oxford and Cambridge, taking their sports with them, so we get the melting pot of different games, and we get the emergence of games like football and rugby, where they were written down, codified at the schools, at the universities, and then spread as they moved over from the education system over to back to become factory team owners and sort of sharing those sports with their factories. Thomas Arnold recognised the value of sport, and he really changed the idea of having games afternoons, promoting muscular Christianity, then the value of loyalty and teamwork, communication skills, leadership skills, all those sort of things he saw in the sports that he used to improve the boys' behaviour at the public schools. So again, that was how sport was becoming developed. And then we get the Clarendon Commission, where they inspected the schools and saw the values of sport and recommended they should be used across all schools, and then developed the idea of a sort of a standardized games afternoon, and this becomes like a rationalized event because sports become consistently recognized and in place. So with this side here, the urbanization, and this side here, the education system, you get the codification of rules, where rules are written down and recorded. We get rationalization, which is where we get the sort of understood and singular game, recognized game from the melting pot of different sports that might have come into, say, the towns or the education system. And then once those two have been sort of sorted out, the sports can have fixtures and leagues. They had the school fixtures, inter-school fixtures, and then we had the factory team fixtures, and they both emerged as one. And that obviously led to things like international fixtures and like town rivalries, and those side of elements of sport. And then to regulate all of this, we get the development of national governing bodies, which really came from the education system, and the upper class public school boys became sort of the administrators of the sports. But without the urbanization happening and the changes in sports there and the education system, they both worked at the same time to create a rationalized sports. Finally, we can look at the impact urbanization has had during the Industrial Revolution. So the first thing, we know that there was a lack of space because everyone was moving from the villages to the towns. Housing was on top of one another, and initially sports declined in playing because there was an increase in disease and pollution, and people were becoming ill, and they didn't have the energy and time to play because their working conditions were harsh and long hours, and they just didn't have the time. But when they did play, they had to really restrict the spaces, so they created dimensions for the pitches. They reduced the playing numbers, but most of the fields that they would have played on beforehand, the mob games would have been played on the fields, they were lost because they were being built upon. The influence of factories had a big impact. So firstly, we get the idea of, well, I talked about the pollution and diseases that had a negative impact on sport initially, and there was a decrease in sports. But the factory teams did emerge from these factories, and they started to represent the communities, and each community had a factory associated with them. And then we get the idea of community teams, and town teams started to emerge. Once you've got these town teams, we get the idea of competition, leagues, fixtures, and the development of stadium, which I talked about previously, and people who weren't playing were able to watch and support their teams. Society changed in general, so we get the emergence of law and order, where you have the police force were introduced. The population were more used to following rules and regulations. They became more civilized, so we get a decline in the mob games because of that. But working hours changed, and we get the 10-hour work act, or the Factory Act, which also was an impact on society, and therefore more regular fixtures could take place because there was always this time off available to play. But also there was that regular time to watch the games as well, which is linked into the work act, the 10-hour work act. And then the other impact is the decline in agriculture because of the factories. So the farming calendar became less important. There was less time for celebrations and festivals, which mob games and festival games were always linked to. So there was a decline in these traditional games, such as the mob games that you may recognise, the Shrovetide mob football and Haxley Hood. They still exist and they still happened on occasions, but not as regular as previously, even though they were occasional anyhow. The stadiums were then also built, and some of the agricultural land was used to build these stadiums. An example is like in Aston Villa, which their first stadium was built on a pig farm. So it gives an idea of their developments due to agriculture and the space that was available. So there's a real whistle-stop tour of the impacts of the Industrial Revolution and the development of sport, and it has hopefully been useful to you. Anyway, good luck in your exams.